Part 1. The Discovery. The day I found the letters was unseasonably warm for October in Maine, the kind of golden autumn day that normally would have had me and Frank on the porch swing, watching the maple leaves dance their way to the ground while sharing coffee and comfortable silence. Instead, I was alone, sweating in the upstairs bedroom that had been ours for 38 years, wrestling with a floorboard that had developed an annoying squeak. Frank had always been the handyman in our marriage. "Let me take care of that, Evelyn," he would say, and I would gladly step aside. But Frank had been gone for 7 months now, and I was learning to do a great many things on my own. I'd watched enough home improvement shows to understand the basic concept. Find the loose board and secure it. Simple enough in theory. I had positioned myself on my hands and knees, a position my 68-year-old joints protested vigorously. When I noticed the board didn't just squeak, it moved more than the others. Curiosity overcame discomfort as I worked my fingers around its edge. The board came up with surprising ease, as if it had been deliberately designed to be removed, and beneath it, a metal box. I sat back on my heels, staring at this unexpected discovery. It was an old ammunition box, army green, with rust blooming along its seams. My first thought was that Frank must have hidden away some keepsake from his time in Vietnam, something too painful to display, but too important to discard. When I lifted it out, it was heavier than I expected. With the box balanced on my lap, I worked the latch open, my mind already composing a story about war memorabilia, or perhaps medals Frank had been too humble to display. What I found instead were letters, dozens of them, neatly bound with faded red ribbon. The paper yellowed with age, and sitting atop them, a photograph. I nearly dropped the box when I saw it. The woman in the picture was beautiful. Dark hair falling in waves around a heart-shaped face. Eyes that seemed to look right through me, even from the glossy surface of a decades-old photograph. She was leaning against a tree, laughing at something or someone beyond the frame. Written on the back, in handwriting I didn't recognize, "To Frank, all my love forever, Hannah." June 1967. Hannah. A name Frank had never mentioned in all our years together. With trembling fingers, I untied the ribbon around the first bundle of letters. The postmarks dated from 1967 through 1969, years before I met Frank, when he was serving in Vietnam. I told myself there was nothing unusual about this. A girlfriend before me. Everyone had a past. But then I saw the second bundle, postmarked 1970 through 1975. Frank and I had met in 1972. We were married in 1974. The room suddenly felt airless. I opened the first letter from the second bundle with hands that didn't feel like my own. "My dearest Frank, your last letter brought me both joy and sorrow. Joy to hear you are well and that your business is prospering. Sorrow to think of the growing distance between us, not just in miles, but in life paths. You ask if I'm angry about your engagement. I could never be angry at you for finding happiness. I understand the impossibility of our situation. What I don't understand is why you insist we must cut all ties. Haven't we proven over these years that what we share exists in its own special realm, harming no one? Think of our weekend in Boston last month, when you held me, when we walked through the public garden as if we were any normal couple. Didn't that feel right? We've managed 3 years of this delicate balance. Why must everything change because of a gold ring? I know you feel honor-bound now. It's one of the countless reasons I love you. But please don't ask me to disappear from your life entirely. I don't think either of us would survive that amputation. All my love, always, Hannah Boston. Frank had told me he'd gone to Boston for a business conference the month before our engagement. I'd stayed behind to help my mother after her hip surgery. My vision blurred as I reached for another letter, this one from 1975. Frank, where silence these past months tells me all I need to know. Marriage has strengthened your resolve, where my pleas could not weaken it. I respect your decision, even as it breaks what's left of my heart. I'm writing to say goodbye, but also to share news I've kept from you, thinking it might change your decision for the wrong reasons. I'm moving to Arizona next month. Portland holds too many memories now, and I won't be going alone. Our daughter Lily is 3 months old now. She has your eyes, and I suspect your stubborn determination. I've enclosed a photograph. Whatever you decide to do with it, whether you keep it or burn it along with this letter, is your choice. I want nothing from you, not support, not acknowledgement, not a reluctant sense of duty. I will tell Lily about you someday, when she's old enough to understand that love sometimes makes a tangle of our best intentions. I will tell her that her father is a good man who made difficult choices. I will never speak of you with bitterness. Be happy, Frank. Live the life you've chosen with your whole heart. That's all I've ever wanted for you. Hannah. Included with the letter was a small photograph of an infant with a shock of dark hair and eyes that I recognized. Eyes I'd looked into every day for 38 years. Eyes that had closed for the final time in a hospital room as I held Frank's hand last March. Frank had a daughter who would be in her late 40s now, close to our own son Michael's age. A daughter he had never mentioned. A daughter he had apparently never acknowledged. My husband, steady, reliable Frank, who coached Little League and never missed a school concert, who remembered every anniversary with flowers and taught Sunday school for 20 years, had hidden an entire child from me, from himself. I don't know how long I sat there on our bedroom floor, surrounded by the physical evidence of a betrayal that spanned decades. The October sunlight shifted across the room as afternoon faded toward evening, but I barely noticed. Lost as I was in a past that was rapidly rewriting itself in my mind, there were more letters, dozens more. Hannah, writing occasionally over the years, always to the same P.O. box I hadn't known existed, sending photographs and updates about Lily, her first day of school, high school graduation, college acceptance. Frank had kept them all, hidden away under our bedroom floor. I found myself reading the words through tears, but whether they were tears of anger, grief, or some complex emotion that had no name, I couldn't say. This woman, this Hannah, had loved my husband, had given birth to his child, had respected his decision to stay with me and Michael, even as she made sure he knew about the daughter growing up without him. And Frank had kept every letter, every photograph, hidden them away where they wouldn't disturb the life he'd chosen, but where he could access them when the house was empty. Had he ever responded? Had he ever met Lily? The letters gave no indication. They were all from Hannah, none from Frank. Night had fallen by the time I finally gathered the strength to replace everything in the metal box exactly as I'd found it. With hands that felt aged beyond their years, I returned the box to its hiding place and carefully repositioned the floorboard. Then I made my way downstairs to pour a glass of wine with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, my mind reeling with questions I could no longer ask the one person who could answer them. Part 2. The decision. Sleep eluded me that night. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, acutely aware of the letters resting beneath the floor, just inches from our bed. From my bed, now. Had Frank lain awake too, over the years, thinking about Hannah and Lily, while I slept beside him, oblivious? By morning, I had moved through shock to a dull, persistent anger, not just at the deception, but at the cowardice. Frank had chosen me, chosen our life together. That much was clear from Hannah's letters. But he'd lacked the courage to fully leave her behind, collecting her letters like talismans from a road not taken. Or perhaps the anger was directed at myself, for not knowing, for not sensing that my husband carried such a significant secret. We'd built what I thought was an honest life together. Had I been naive, willfully blind? Over coffee that I could barely taste, I considered my options. I could pretend I'd never found the letters, reseal that floorboard, and try to forget what I now knew. Preserve the untarnished memory of Frank that our son Michael cherished. Keep the comfortable narrative of our marriage intact. Or I could try to find Lily, Frank's other child, Michael's half-sister. Did she know about us? Had Hannah kept her promise to tell her about her father someday? Was she out there in Arizona or somewhere else now, perhaps with children of her own, grandchildren Frank had never known? And if I found her, what then? What could I possibly say to this stranger who shared my husband's blood, but not his life? What right did I have to disrupt her world with revelations about a father who had chosen absence? I was still turning these questions over in my mind when Michael called that evening. "How's the house, Mom? Getting cold up there yet?" My son's voice, so much like his father's, nearly undid my fragile composure. "Not too bad yet. Indian summer, they're calling it." "You sound tired. Everything okay?" I almost told him then. Michael had a right to know he had a half-sister. But the words caught in my throat. "Just didn't sleep well," I said instead. "How are Diane and the kids?" We chatted about my grandchildren, Michael's veterinary practice, the upcoming holidays, normal family topics that now felt like a thin veneer over deeper, hidden truths. After we hung up, I found myself at my computer, typing Hannah and Lily into search engines along with Arizona and various combinations of potential last names. Thousands of results appeared, none that I could definitively connect to the Hannah from the letters. I needed more information, a last name, the city in Arizona, something more specific than what I had. That's when I remembered the metal box had a false bottom. I'd noticed it when replacing everything, a slight discrepancy in the depth compared to the exterior dimensions. At the time, I'd been too overwhelmed to investigate further. Now, I returned to our bedroom, pried up the floorboard again, and retrieved the box. Sure enough, with careful manipulation, the bottom panel lifted to reveal another compartment. Inside was a small manila envelope containing a birth certificate, a handful of newspaper clippings, and a more recent photograph than the others. The birth certificate was for Lily Hannah Bennett, born April 12, 1975, in Portland, Maine. Mother, Hannah Elizabeth Bennett. Father, Frank Thomas Wilson. He was listed as the father. Frank had acknowledged his daughter legally, even as he kept her existence a secret from me. The newspaper clippings were mostly small items from an Arizona newspaper spanning the 1990s. Lily Bennett making the dean's list at Arizona State University. Lily Bennett accepting a position as an elementary school teacher in Flagstaff. Lily Bennett Martinez marrying Miguel Martinez in a ceremony at Oak Creek Canyon. The most recent photograph showed a woman in her early 40s with Frank's eyes and smile, standing between a tall man with salt and pepper hair and two teenage children, a boy and a girl. Written on the back, "Frank thought you'd want to see your grandchildren. Raphael is 16 now. Sophia is 14. They know about you. Lily." The note was dated just 2 years ago. "They know about you." I sat heavily on the edge of the bed, the evidence of my husband's second life spread across the quilt I'd made for our 30th anniversary. Not just a long-ago mistake then. Not just letters from a past he couldn't quite let go. Frank had known his daughter, at least from a distance, known about his grandchildren, and he'd kept all of it from me. The anger that swept through me then was like nothing I'd ever experienced in our marriage. Not during our worst arguments, not even when I'd found out about Frank's brief emotional affair with a coworker 15 years ago, an indiscretion we'd worked through in counseling. This was different. This was a fundamental breach of the partnership I thought we'd had. This was Frank, leading a compartmentalized life, maintaining connections he had actively hidden from me for our entire marriage. I carefully returned everything to the box, my mind made up. I would find Lily Bennett Martinez. Not to disrupt her life or to insert myself where I wasn't wanted, but because the weight of secrets was too heavy to bear alone. Because Michael deserved to know about his half-sister. Because whatever Frank's reasons for his silence, I refused to perpetuate it. With renewed purpose, I returned to my computer. Armed with Lily's full married name and the knowledge she had lived in Flagstaff, I found her within minutes. A fourth-grade teacher at a Flagstaff elementary school. Her professional biography mentioning her husband, Miguel, a physical therapist, and their 2 children. Before I could lose my nerve, I drafted an email to the address listed on the school website. Dear Miss Bennett Martinez, my name is Evelyn Wilson. I was married to Frank Wilson for 38 years until his passing this past March. Yesterday, I discovered letters from your mother and photographs of you that Frank had kept hidden throughout our marriage. This is difficult to write, and perhaps even more difficult for you to receive. I don't know what relationship, if any, you had with Frank over the years. I didn't know of your existence until yesterday. I'm not writing to disrupt your life or to make demands. I simply felt you should know of Frank's passing if you weren't already aware. Additionally, you have a half-brother, Michael, who doesn't yet know about you, but who I believe would want to. If you prefer that I not contact you further, I will respect that wish. If, however, you're open to communication, I would welcome the opportunity to learn more about the side of Frank's life that he kept separate from ours. Sincerely, Evelyn Wilson. I read it over twice. Trying to strike the right balance between openness and respect for boundaries that might exist. Then, before I could reconsider, I clicked send and closed my laptop. Whatever came next would have to wait until morning. Part 3. The response. The reply came 3 days later, while I was deadheading the last of the season's roses, preparing the garden for winter as Frank had taught me to do early in our marriage. My phone chimed with the email notification, and I nearly dropped my gardening shears in my haste to check it. Dear Mrs. Wilson, your email came as quite a shock, though perhaps it shouldn't have. Dad, Frank, never mentioned you either, though I knew he was married with a son. It seems he kept his 2 families quite separate. I'm sorry to hear of his passing. Though our relationship was complicated and largely conducted through letters and rare visits, he was still my father. I had actually tried to reach him several months ago when my son Raphael graduated high school, but my email went unanswered. Now I understand why. To answer what must be your most pressing question, yes, I knew about Frank my entire life. My mother never hid his identity from me. She told me he had another family that he had chosen to stay with, but that he cared about me in his own way. When I was 18, I reached out to him directly for the first time. After that, we established a cautious correspondence and met in person perhaps a dozen times over the past 30 years, always when he was supposedly on business trips. He met my children twice. He attended neither my college graduation nor my wedding, though he sent gifts for both. I understood the boundaries, though I can't say I never resented them. I recognize this must be incredibly painful for you to learn. I've had a lifetime to process my complicated feelings about Frank and his choices. You've had only days. I would be open to further communication and perhaps even meeting someday, if that's something you and your son might want. My children, particularly Raphael, have expressed curiosity about their grandfather's other family over the years. Take whatever time you need to process this. I'm not going anywhere. Sincerely, Lily Bennett Martinez. I read the email 3 times. Sitting on the garden bench Frank had built for our 25th anniversary. A dozen in-person meetings over 30 years. 2 visits with his grandchildren. All while I believed he was at conferences, meeting clients, attending industry events. The level of deception was staggering. The careful compartmentalization of his life. The lies told to both sides to maintain the separation. And yet, he hadn't abandoned Lily entirely. He'd acknowledged paternity on her birth certificate. He'd maintained contact, albeit limited. He'd met his grandchildren. Within the constraints of the life he'd chosen with me, the primary life he'd chosen, he tried to be some version of a father to his daughter. Did that make it better or worse? I wasn't sure. That evening, I called Michael and asked him to visit that weekend without Diane and the children. There's something important we need to discuss, was all I said when he pressed for details. The next 3 days passed in a fog of memory and reassessment. Every business trip Frank had taken, every weekend conference, every late night at the office, all now suspect. How many had been legitimate, and how many had been opportunities to connect with his other family? Had he been thinking of Lily during our son's milestones, comparing Michael's achievements to hers, regretting his choices while maintaining the appearance of contentment? When Michael arrived on Friday evening, I had the metal box waiting on the coffee table. I'd removed the most painful letters, the ones written during our engagement and early marriage that might tarnish Michael's view of his parents' relationship, but left enough for him to understand the situation. His reaction progressed much as mine had. Shock, disbelief, anger, confusion. But underneath, I sensed something else. Curiosity. "I have a sister," he said finally, holding the most recent photograph of Lily and her family. "And a nephew and niece." He looked up at me, his expression torn. "Did Dad ever say anything? Give any hint?" I shook my head. Nothing. I had no idea until I found the box. Michael was quiet for a long moment. "What do you want to do, Mom?" It was the question I'd been asking myself all week. What did I want? To protect the memory of my marriage by keeping this revelation close? To reach out and connect with the woman who shared Frank's blood? To try to understand my husband's divided life? "I've already been in touch with Lily," I admitted, and told him about our brief email exchange. Michael nodded slowly. "I'd like to meet her, and her kids, my niece and nephew." The words sounded strange coming from him, a man who had grown up believing he had no siblings. "Would that be okay with you, Mom?" Would it? Could I face the living embodiment of Frank's deception? The daughter he had acknowledged in private, but never in our shared life? "Yes," I said finally. "I think it would be good for both of us." 2 weeks later, Lily Bennett Martinez stood on my front porch, her husband, Miguel, beside her. Their children, Raphael and Sophia, hanging back uncertainly by the rental car. She was shorter than I'd expected, with Frank's eyes and smile, but Hannah's dark hair, now streaked with gray like my own. Mrs. Wilson, she said formally, extending her hand. Thank you for inviting us. I took her hand, but found a handshake inadequate for the moment. Instead, I pulled her into a gentle embrace. Evelyn, I corrected softly, and thank you for coming all this way. If she was surprised by the hug, she didn't show it. Her arms came around me tentatively, then with growing confidence. When we separated, I saw tears in her eyes, Frank's eyes, and felt answering moisture in my own. This is my husband, Miguel, she said, composing herself, and our children, Raphael and Sophia. I greeted them all, struck by how much Raphael resembled Frank at that age. The same straight nose, the same way of standing with his weight shifted slightly to one side. Frank's grandson, who had met him only twice. Michael emerged from the house then, his expression a complex mix of emotions as he approached the half-sister he'd never known existed until 2 weeks ago. Hi, he said simply, extending his hand to Lily. I'm Michael. She took his hand, but as I had done, pulled him into a hug instead. I've known about you my whole life, she said. It's so strange to finally meet you. Something in Michael's face shifted then, surprise giving way to a tentative warmth. Come inside, he said, all of you. We have a lot to talk about. The afternoon unfolded with an ease I hadn't expected. We gathered in the living room, awkward at first, but soon finding common ground. Michael and Lily discovered they shared not only their father's eyes, but his love of history and tendency to quote obscure movies. Raphael was considering veterinary school, his half-uncle's profession. Sophia played the piano, sitting down at Frank's old upright to play a piece she'd composed herself while we listened in appreciative silence. As sunlight shifted across the room, we exchanged stories, separate narratives that had run parallel for decades without intersection. Lily spoke of the letters from Frank that had arrived like clockwork on her birthday and Christmas, of the rare visits where he'd seemed torn between joy at seeing her and anxiety about maintaining the separation between his worlds. Michael shared memories of fishing trips and science projects, of the father who had been physically present but sometimes emotionally distant in ways he'd never understood until now. I found myself studying Lily throughout the day, this woman who was both stranger and family. I searched for resentment in her eyes, for bitterness toward the woman Frank had chosen over her mother, but found none. Just a wistful curiosity, a genuine desire to connect with the family that had unknowingly been kept from her. As evening approached, I pulled out photo albums I'd prepared, visual evidence of the life Frank had led with us. Lily reciprocated with digital photos on her tablet, filling in gaps of the life Frank had glimpsed only in fragments. He came to Raphael's middle school graduation. She explained, showing a photo where Frank stood awkwardly at the edge of a family group. Said he had a business meeting in Phoenix and could stop by for a few hours. I recognized the tie he was wearing, remembered buying it for him the previous Christmas. The pain was still there. The shock of discovering my husband's divided loyalties had not faded. But alongside it now was something else, a growing understanding of the complex man I had loved. Frank had made choices as a young man that set him on a path of deception. But within the boundaries of that flawed choice, he had tried to fulfill responsibilities to everyone he loved, imperfectly, inadequately, but he had tried. Would you all stay for dinner? I asked as the afternoon light began to fade. I'd like to hear more. Over lasagna made from Frank's mother's recipe, a family tradition he had passed to both his children, it turned out. The conversation flowed more easily. Stories were shared, connections discovered, bridges tentatively built across the chasm Frank had maintained between his divided worlds. As Miguel helped me clear the dishes, he spoke quietly. Lily was nervous about coming here, afraid you'd hate her for being the evidence of Frank's indiscretion. I shook my head. How could I hate her for something that wasn't her fault? Frank made his choices. So did Hannah. Lily was just a child caught in the middle. "You're a remarkable woman, Evelyn," he said, his eyes kind. "Not everyone would be so gracious." I wasn't sure if grace was the right word for what I felt. Acceptance, perhaps. The recognition that human hearts are complicated, that love and loyalty can be both flawed and genuine simultaneously. Before they left that evening, Lily and I had a moment alone on the porch while the others chatted in the yard. "I want you to know," she said carefully, "my mother never tried to pull him away from your family. She was clear with me from the beginning that Frank had made his choice, and she respected it." "It sounds like she was a remarkable woman," I said, meaning it. "She was." Lily hesitated. "Would you like to see a picture of her? A recent one, I mean?" I nodded, and she pulled out her phone, scrolling to a photo of an elegant woman in her 70s with silver-streaked dark hair and kind eyes. Hannah, the woman who had loved my husband first, who had raised his daughter alone, who had never spoken of him with bitterness. "She passed away 3 years ago," Lily said quietly. "Cancer. Frank came to the funeral, though he stayed at the back. I don't think many people there knew who he was. 3 years ago, I remembered Frank taking a fishing weekend alone, returning subdued and distant. Another deception in a lifetime of compartmentalization. Thank you for showing me," I said. "And thank you for coming today, for being open to whatever this is becoming." Lily smiled. Frank's smile. "Family," she said simply. "Complicated, messy, unexpected family." As I watched them drive away that evening, Michael standing beside me on the porch, I felt something shift inside me. The anger wasn't gone, might never be completely gone, but alongside it now was something else. Gratitude for this unexpected extension of family. This connection that Frank, for all his flaws, had made possible through his blood, if not his honesty. "Will you tell me when you're ready to talk to them again?" Michael asked. "I'd like to stay in touch with Lily, get to know my niece and nephew better." "Of course," I said, leaning against my son's shoulder. "I think I'd like that too." Later that night, alone in the bedroom I'd shared with Frank for 38 years, I knelt beside the loose floorboard one final time. I removed the metal box, carried it downstairs, and placed it on the dining room table where we had all shared a meal hours before. The box no longer needed to be hidden. Its contents, painful as they were part of our family story now. A story more complex and flawed than I had believed, but also somehow richer for the revelation. Frank had failed in many ways. His deception had hurt everyone who loved him on both sides of the divide he'd maintained. But he had also loved, imperfectly, inadequately, but genuinely. And from that love, however flawed its expression, had come connections that would outlast him. As I traced my fingers over the metal box that had held his secrets for decades, I thought about the letters inside. Testaments to a life divided, but not unlived. To responsibilities honored inadequately, but not abandoned entirely. Perhaps that was Frank's legacy, in the end. Not the perfect husband and father I had believed him to be, but a flawed man who had tried, within the constraints of his own weaknesses, to love and care for all those who depended on him. And perhaps my legacy would be to forge connections he had been too afraid to create. to build bridges across the chasm he had maintained for a lifetime. Tomorrow I would call Lily and invite her family for Thanksgiving. I would suggest that Michael bring Diane and the children to meet their newly discovered relatives. I would begin the slow work of weaving together these separate strands into something new, not erasing the past or excusing its deceptions, but creating a future with room for all the complex truths of who we were and who we might become together. For now, though, I simply sat with the open box before me, no longer afraid of its contents or the truths they revealed. The letters under the floorboards had changed everything I thought I knew about my marriage. But they had also opened a door to connections I would never have discovered otherwise. Sometimes, it seems, the most painful revelations can lead to unexpected gifts. And sometimes, the ending of one story, even one built partly on deception, can become the beginning of another, more honest one. I was ready, at last, to turn the page. The end. The letters under the floorboards had changed everything I thought I knew about my marriage. But they had also opened a door to connections I would never have discovered otherwise. Sometimes, it seems, the most painful revelations can lead to unexpected gifts. The letters under the floorboards had changed